Timber Talks is brought to you by Wood Solutions. Stay up to date with the latest in timber, the building material that is strong, safe and sustainable. Here is your host, Adam Jones.
Hello everyone. To begin season 4, we're doing a best of Timber Talks 4-part series. So having over 50 episodes now, we've got a bank of fantastic content that we'd like to retrospectively pull out from the archives. So the first part was on innovation and technology. So we had some incredible speakers in that. I recommend you go back and listen to that. And today's episode, we'll be looking at sustainability and health, obviously two very big trends when it comes to construction and architecture. And we've got some fantastic speakers for you. First off, we'll be speaking with Davina Rooney, who's the CEO at the Green Building Council of Australia. So we'll be discussing how we can mitigate the risks of global warming and how the built environment needs to change. Secondly, you'll hear from Ken Morrison, who's the CEO at the Property Council of Australia, and he'll be talking about how we can move our construction codes forward and improve the baseline of buildings, also to mitigate the risks of climate change. So our carbon targets are to get to carbon neutral by 2050, to limit by 1.5 to 2 degrees, which is obviously not good at all, but hopefully not Armageddon kind of levels. How do you think we're tracking in Australia and say around the world in reaching these targets?
Well, there's no sugarcoating this. Currently, the metrics are going the wrong way. And whilst carbon neutral for 2050, is the critical goal, it's an overarching carbon budget. We can't actually do nothing till 2049 and then hit zero. We'll have passed our tipping points a long time ago. And for those of you looking at the IPCC curves, those curves are becoming steeper and steeper. So carbon neutral by 2050 in property space, which is the context that we're discussing, that really means all new buildings carbon neutral by 2030 and a large amount of the existing stock carbon neutral by 2030. And then the harder to abate sectors, as in the ones where we don't actually know all the answers yet, they're the ones that we need to be gliding in the last few years. And so when we look at that, what do we mean by harder to abate sectors? They're embodied carbon, or what we call upfront carbon within building materials, are often the harder to abate sectors. So we're advocating with the World Green Building Council the goal of 40% reduction by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And I can't tell you how excited I am by industry's response to that. So since we put out the call for action with the World Green Building Council last year, we had InfraBuild step up and make a net zero for 2030 commitment in steel, which is just extraordinary. And then we've also then aimed time, the other things that we're seeing at the same time is we have our first carbon neutral cement coming on the market, which, if you absolutely look at that, that is such an extraordinary turnaround. I couldn't have been any more excited when Wholesome told me that they were getting Climate Act certified for, some of their cement products. Game changer. So what we need is, the big plans, but then we need the interim plans and we need the pathways by which industry is going to get there. And also, importantly, a number of us need to get together and do those in a concerted way with combination of voluntary tools, long-term pathways, alignment with government. So it creates the right ingredients, the Goldilocks ingredients, for there to be the right business case for industry to change, because these changes mean investments by key businesses and we need to work towards the right climate for those.
Yeah. And with that kind of certainty, the business case for doing something like your green steel and your green concrete, which, might be a little bit more upfront now, but over time it's going to have a clear benefit. And then also, obviously from a timber point of view, getting the supply chains ready to be able to supply sustainably the full amount. So embodied carbon is a very exciting area.
And you're right, timber has some natural advantages in this space, but we have to look at how we sustainably scale whilst managing, the complexity of the species impact that wraps around it. So these, when you talk materials, there's never a simple answer. And so, I think the real benefit of the long-term planning is to actually enable those industries really appropriately to have the time and space to work through the complexity of issues and move in a sensible and sustained manner. One of the challenges we've seen is if there isn't the Goldilocks ingredients, we sometimes see knee jerks where one part moves forward and something else becomes challenged. The thing that we've learnt about sustainability problems is that they're wicked problems, and if you resolve part of it but not another piece, it's that second piece that comes to bite you. So laying out long-term plans and long-term pathways to invest in these areas is really critical.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we've actually been very successful on in an untrumpeted way with governments is around having a forward trajectory within our construction code so that we actually know where we're going in terms of some of these emissions-related issues. At the moment, as you know, we just sort of lurch from one change to another with the construction code. There's no pathway that we're on, and given the country and the globe is adopting 2050 targets and will progressively update those over time, it's sort of disconnected from that. So what we've been arguing is that much better to have a trajectory of known changes that roll out or can roll out over time. That means industry knows where we're going with these code changes, and they can position around a known set of changes that are happening in the future and say, yes, we want to be early adopters, or no, we'll wait till the code actually changes, or we know that in 2 years' time we need to adjust our material selections or our manufacturing or whatever it might be. So state and territory governments in the Commonwealth have actually all signed off on that trajectory. There's still more work to do about what that trajectory actually can look like, but in concept they've done that. So I think that's a good thing, something we've lobbied hard for, and I think it's a sensible thing which helps support the industry as it continues to evolve in this area.
In the next section, you'll hear from 4 different speakers a little bit more granular on sustainability. First of all, Andrew Waugh on the impact of material choices. Secondly, Ulrich Dangel on sustainable forest management. Thirdly, Stephen Mitchell on the end-of-life options for timber. And finally, Kate Nason on prefabrication and Passivhaus.
So I think that as we move forward with an understanding around climate change and the impact of our actions, then the production of cement, the production of steel, concrete, the way in which we build buildings even, with the kind of the amounts of pollution, noise pollution, air pollution that are involved, I think these will lead us to reconsider the way in which we build buildings currently. I guess that's sort of, the timber that we use is all certified. So it's either FSC or PEFC certified. And that means that these are timbers that come from farmed, managed resource. Every tree that is cut down is replanted with 5 more trees. And that there are lots of environmental considerations around the felling of those trees. So it really is kind of like the childhood lessons of photosynthesis come back to us, and we know that as a tree grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then releases oxygen. So in a sense becomes the absolute perfect carbon store, and so that when you build with a tree, what you're doing is you're actually, you're locking that carbon within the structure of the building itself. So you have a lighter, faster, cleaner method of construction, which in itself is a carbon store. The oxygen in the carbon dioxide is put back into the atmosphere for us all to breathe and enjoy. And so it really is locking down the carbon. And if you consider the production of cement, how cement is made, how concrete is then made with cement, all those processes are actually, they're very energy intensive, but they also emit carbon dioxide as part of the chemical process that forms the cement.
It seems like it's really important where you source your timber from, because we obviously don't want to be taking or increasing the demand of timber from places where it is maybe net deforestation. So can you tell us a little bit about the idea of what sustainable forest management is?
Yes, I mean sustainability and sustainable forest management really, as a guiding principle, was developed in 18th century European forestry regulations at a time when the early industrialization put a great strain and demand on wood as a building material and energy source, and the Europeans realized very early on that in order to ensure wood supply, they had to come up with a system to ensure sustainable supply for wood going forward, and not depleting and deforesting all the forests that they had. So these regulations have been in place for 300 years, and it's pretty much, kind of, to put it very simple, if you're looking at sustainable forest management, it's really about as simple as saying, for every tree that you harvest, you plant another one, making sure you have supply going forward, and also for the future generations. Now, forest management, is obviously a little bit more complex than that, and it really looks at, and it really varies from region to region, but it has different concerns, and might look at obviously timber production for economic purposes, but might also focus on soil and watershed protection, biodiversity conservation, and then in many countries also cultural and recreational purposes. And I think to understand kind of managed forestry, we might have to talk about what an unmanaged forest is to begin with. So if you imagine an unmanaged forest is a forest that grows without any human intervention. So as the trees mature, they compete for water, sunlight, and nutrients, and that causes some of the trees to die while others prosper. And obviously, trees only have a certain lifespan. So it's at certain ages they just die off, but they just die off and become part of the underbrush. Also, as the number of trees and their age and diameter increase, there's a chance that natural disturbances can cause pretty severe impacts to forest stands. So let's say wildfire, storms, and insect infestation. As forests get denser, unmanaged forests, those natural disturbances can cause significant tree loss. I mean, there's nothing wrong with obviously not managing a forest, but since trees store a lot of carbon, not managing a forest can actually lead to significant carbon losses over time if entire forests burn down over time. And so what a managed forest does is it grows with human intervention. Again, the focus can vary. There are obviously different aspects that need to be considered, like I mentioned, timber production, and obviously biodiversity conservation. But a managed forest pretty much means that as trees mature, those older trees that actually at some point slow down in terms of their carbon absorption rate, those older trees are cut out and make room to grow. And as a result, the carbon dioxide that tree has captured during its lifetime is actually stored in the tree or in the wood product itself that's made out of that tree. And then we have a new generation of trees that can grow in its place, and kind of renewing that cycle.
Yeah, those EPDs do include a few different options, and that's an area of timber use that, or at end of life, that's an area of timber life cycle that I think there's been a bit of misinformation about, and new information. There's some new peer-reviewed research which we referred to in those EPDs. So when it comes to end of life, you've got reuse, recycling, renewable energy, or burial in a well-managed landfill. They're your options for your timber. And often end-of-life options are very locally based, which is why we've included each scenario. Because timber hasn't used much energy to make, it means that end-of-life timber is not generally internationally traded. It's you've got to have a local solution, because so in terms of reuse or using salvage or recycled timber, you're prolonging the amount of time that the carbon stored in it is out above ground and not back in the air. So think longer term usage, the better. Chipping, another option is chipping and recycling lower quality salvage timber. That can be a good option, particularly if it can be recycled into new particle board products. And I'm helping Borg Polytech with doing just that in Oberon in New South Wales. And D&R Henderson, who make particle board product in Victoria, they've been doing that for a few years, but Polytech are just starting out on that. You can use very low quality recovered wood for thermal energy and electricity generation. So you can burn it in place of fossil fuels. And Laminex up in Queensland, they just received a $500,000 grant to investigate the feasibility of that. And so if you're not using coal or gas, you're not putting fossil fuel emissions into the air. But even burial in a well-managed landfill can have substantial benefits. That peer-reviewed research I referred to earlier, that's found that the carbon in Australian wood and many other woods can just sit there in a well-managed landfill for over a very long period of time. So that's why when Thinkstep did the EPDs, we included all those options, not just for Australian wood products, but for New Zealand Wood Products and Manufacturers Association. So I'm talked a lot about Australian timber products, but some of this can apply equally to some of our imported products.
Absolutely. And you mentioned with prefabrication, you can improve the construction tolerances and manage quality to a high degree. How does this enable Passivhaus design and achieving this form of construction method?
So the tolerances are quite important in Passivhaus. So one of the scariest things for builders is the air tightness factor. You're targeting a 0.6 air change rate, which is, God knows how many times better than what we have at the moment. But the average house is built to about 10 air changes per hour, so it's a substantially tighter building. And to get to that level of air tightness, you really do need to pay attention to the way things are obviously sealed. Windows are installed, how walls are joined to roof elements, how the structure is working, what materials you use as well, and the sequence that you build it in. So the prefab aspect and the off-site construction opportunities there allow you to essentially, it puts more pressure on the design side. So you really have to figure things out when you're at the drawing board stage. And I think, without leaving it till it's on site, like a lot of details are still sort of sorted out, on site when problems occur. Really having it sorted before it even leaves the factory is a big head start. And as I said before, being able to pre-install things like windows and those more tricky elements to get right it just makes life easier. It gives you a chance to do it before you're in the weather, before you're always under a tight construction time frame, but it just gives you that leeway to get it right before it heads off with sub-trades poking holes in it, whatnot.
Yeah. Well, for Monash, you use CLT for that project, and prefabrication helped a lot. How else can timber help in terms of energy efficiency, thinking about the thermal properties as well?
Well, it's a lot better than using steel and concrete. It's got a much lower thermal conductivity. So it's quite interesting if you put a steel stud with insulation bats between it into a thermal model, and you look at the overall performance of that wall. In many cases, you may as well not put any insulation in that wall at all, because of the thermal bridging happening through the steel studs. Now, if you use timber, you can actually improve the thermal performance of that whole, wall composition. So it makes building to the Passivhaus standard much, much easier. And that's with timber stick studs, for example. Now with the CLT, you often still need to insulate on the outside of it. but it reduces the amount of insulation, I'd say. And if you've got any connections, such as the Gillies Hall, there were a lot of the shading fins had to be connected back to the building. It just made that a lot easier. There was less sort of, fancy thermal bridging, mitigation connection pieces that needed to be used. The timber itself sort of absorbed some of that, the issue there. So yeah, I'd say it goes hand in hand, and it also looks at the embodied carbon, which we shouldn't forget about when we're designing buildings.
Mm. For the last part of this Best Of series on sustainability and wellness, we'll be looking at wellness, and setting the scene will be Jack Noonan, the Vice President at the International Wellbeing Institute. And then secondly, you'll hear from Marie-France Stendahlf, who's the Head of Business Development and Wider Architecture, on using architecture as medicine. And finally, Caroline Pidcock from Pidcock Designs on material connection to nature in the biophilic design framework.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first thing that I continually remind people is that we spend a lot of our time indoors. I probably don't need to remind people of that fact right now. You and I are both based in Melbourne right now, and we're in a stage 4 lockdown. But on average, we spend about 90% of our time indoors. I think that's a really overused statistic, but to put it in a different way, the average Australian will live to 84 years. 74 years of that average Australian's life will be spent indoors. About 5 years of that average Australian's life will be spent outdoors, and somewhat depressingly, about 5 years of that average Australian's life will be spent in transit, so in cars or trains or buses or that kind of thing. So we spend a stack of time indoors. What we do know from all of the research is it's actually the physical and social environment that is the number one determinant of our health. That was something that was quite surprising to me because, as I mentioned, when I started kind of my studies, I actually studied to become a geneticist, and I always thought that the genes that you got were basically, they were the cards that you were dealt for life, right? And that was kind of what you had to deal with. But the reality is that the physical and social environment is the number one determinant of your health, and it has more of an impact on your health than your access to medical care or the genes that you've got. So if you're spending so much time indoors, if the physical and social environment is the number one determinant of your health, it's really important to acknowledge that the buildings that we work in, that we live in, that we spend time in, have a fundamental impact on our health and well-being, and that's what we're, what we're talking about.
So move on to wellbeing now. Yesterday in your presentation, you were speaking about the potential of using architecture as medicine and improving wellbeing. Can you talk a little bit about what this is all about?
It's been research for more than 30 years about it. One of the person that many people knows, his name is Roger Ulrich. I think it's an American scientific researcher that now lives in Sweden. Yeah. And he had, for more than 30 years, made research about evidence-based design and how that can, physical aspect can help to feel better and the healing process. So there is 4 aspects that it's been studied about physical. This is also the sensory, but if we stay in the physical, it's about nature, contact with the nature, fresh air, daylight, and silence. And it's very difficult to scientifically prove it because you need to measure. But we had worked with that in psychiatric project because it's, in a way, it's a good a place to see if you do heal better. And we had measure after the project that with applying an approach of contact with nature and daylight and silence, that people do feel better. That's in this specific project, but we didn't have any sample to compare with. But in this project, we did show that people were staying a shorter time, and it was less aggressivity when they were there. And it also for the employees who were working at the hospital, that there was less sick leave probably for the reason that it was a better milieu, a place to work, but also if the patient were less aggressive and maybe easier to handle.
Yeah.
The next one is material connection with nature, which is where I think timber comes into its own. And it's obviously something that people, you've done studies that show how important that is in making people feel good in their environment.
Yeah, so have you been, surprised with this research? So tagging on to what I said earlier with how they found that, there's so many people unhappy with their work in environment. They found that workers in work environments, when exposed to wood, feel more connected to nature and have more positive associations with their workplace. And also those with wood in their work environments, and it doesn't have to be just exposed structural timber, it can be exposed surfaces and any timber in their view. They also take less sick leave, and it was pretty surprising. I think on average from 6 down to 2 sick days per year. And also wood is correlated with higher levels of concentration, improved mood and personal productivity. So were you surprised with some of this research?
I suppose it's always great to hear what you suspect backed up with data. And I mean, I personally, my family, my father's family were timber millers, for over 100 years. So I have a very strong connection to timber, and I love to have it in my spaces and rooms, and I just think it's a very it's a timeless material that is always beautiful, and therefore and I suppose it is a really important part of biophilic design is to have that connection to a natural system, even if it isn't a tree in my house. It sort of speaks to the beauty of nature every day, and that has such a strong impact. It's great to see the research backing up that intuitive thinking.
I hope you enjoyed that best of series on sustainability and wellness. Remember to subscribe or leave a review. It helps us with our ratings and other people find this podcast. Also, in that podcast, you would have heard a little bit about the Wood Solutions EPDs and also the research on biophilic design with exposed wooden surfaces. So both of these I will leave in the show notes.